I like to start out the podcast now because it seems like we have one too many recurring guests, especially the guy on the left over there. So, how do the two of you know each other?
So I guess it goes back to when Spencer was still working for Schuko, Schuko and Technoform. We worked together. Technoform supplies a lot of Schuko's thermal barriers, and we were working together a lot through the Facade Tectonics Institute and also through our own companies, looking for ways to do business with each other in North America.
Yeah, I think it was really the Facade Tectonics Institute activities in New York specifically, because I used to be based in New York with Schuko, worked out of the New York office, and we were host to several of the Facade Tectonics, meetings and helping them to kind of coordinate, expanding their operation and planning and whatnot. So yeah, there was a lot of interface there at that time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I was thinking of a few different topics I wanted to cover, but what we were just talking about is actually kind of interesting because I had my own incident of having to install a AC unit for a certain lady in Chinatown yesterday in New York. So we'll get into that story in a minute. But just thinking about how much the envelope plays into the specific climate that you're in, and how in New York you have such temperature extremities that you rely so heavily on the mechanical systems. But when I was visiting Vancouver for the first time, it was really the first time I realized that some areas just don't use air conditioning, and that's the norm. And maybe a lot of the new construction buildings utilize it, but Spencer, what have you seen in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's climate specific, design and architecture, right? So, historically, I think the past few years you can't really look at those because we've had some extreme outliers in terms of the weather patterns, the climate changing in the Pacific Northwest. But historically, the summers are very mild, right? And it's kind of like Germany in that way, where there's not a need for air conditioning because the comfort criteria is within kind of an acceptable limit, right? So maybe it's a little bit warmer than what you would find in like a high-rise office building, where everybody's in suits or something like that. But it's still acceptable. You're not dealing with the extreme heat and humidity that you have, on the East Coast, or the extreme high temperatures and dry heat that you have in the Southwest. So once that becomes kind of part of the culture and the building tradition, right? It's very difficult to move away from that because there's a huge cost premium to add the kind of mechanical systems that you need for cooling. And of course, you can look at heat pump solutions, right, which offer kind of benefits on both ends. But you know it's interesting. Like I draw a lot of parallels to Central Europe because in a lot of ways it's a very similar kind of climate condition, right? And so if the people are living here and they're happy with it, then there's no need for it. But now with climate change, everyone's kind of wondering, like, oh well, we keep having these heat waves, in the Pacific Northwest. Like, what, I guess we should start thinking about air conditioning. And now what ends up happening, right? If you live in a house or you're in a building where it doesn't have these, functions, and it's not well insulated enough or shaded well enough to maintain the comfort criteria, what do? You buy an air conditioner, right? And you put it in somewhere in the house or in the building, and you condition one zone of the building, and you use a lot more energy than you normally would if the building, had been designed more appropriately from the beginning. So.
And that's, I guess, also the issue is that we all think about, let's go to air conditioning, but maybe we should start by designing the envelope more appropriately. And then you can make up the difference with heating or air conditioning, because I actually just posted something there last night because the New York Times just had an opinion piece that we are over reliant on air conditioning. And when the power goes out, people die. You can see that in Phoenix, where we are over reliant on air conditioning. Maybe not so much in Seattle and here on the East Coast, but that's an issue, is with the grid becoming perhaps less resilient as we're making it less reliant on fossil fuels. We have to make our buildings more resilient.
Well, if we think about performance and utility bills and carbon footprint, sure, I think we can make the case for a better performing envelope and more efficient mechanical systems. But in terms of commercial multifamily construction, what do you think people actually care about? And I hear Spencer talk about occupant comfort and things like better air quality and enhanced acoustic performance. And maybe some of these things matter more, especially in a post-COVID world, and having better indoor air quality, or living in a more sustainable environment, or development. So I guess for the longest time, what do you think people used to care about? Was it just price driven? And then how have you seen that evolve in the past few years?
Well, I mean, I think from the perspective of like the post-COVID world, right? Like there's
Let me,
now,
yeah, I mean, let me rephrase it. Say,
yeah.
forget the you're trying to help the developer make the pitch to market their unit versus your girlfriend, your cousin. People are going to look at a building. What do you think people are like ultimately looking for and care about?
I mean, look, I think the comfort piece is important, right? Like I don't know, maybe, I don't have metrics on this, but I can say, the prevalence of, climate controlled spaces, is much greater than it was, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, right? Like we have mechanical systems that can allow us to dial in, the comfort of our buildings very accurately, and I think when we talk about residential, dwelling units, it's, there's this, I think, expectation with new construction that it's controllable. Like you have an environment that you can dial in your comfort criteria to the degree, almost for every room, right? Like, and if it doesn't have that, it's like, wait, this is a new building. This is a little archaic, right? Like, and it goes with houses in multifamily, but multifamily especially because, you typically have like a building wide mechanical system, right? And you get a lot of optimization with multifamily dwelling construction in terms of, conservation of heat, and, you still have like, orientation issues and adjacent site condition issues that can affect the overall comfort and, performance. But, it's my opinion that, if you're looking at a new building and a new multifamily building, the expectation is that you have ultimate control over the comfort mechanically, like all the time. Doesn't matter what time of year it is, right? I mean, I think that's just where things are at. I don't know, Helen, if you've got a different perspective, but
I don't. I don't really know whether people know what to ask for. I
yeah,
mean, especially when you're a first-time buyer, or you haven't lived in a multifamily apartment before. Do you even know what to ask for? I mean, you know about your marble countertops and stuff like that, but do you know what you're getting yourself into when you walk into an apartment that's got, floor to ceiling windows, and you don't know the difference between single pane and triple pane, and solid control and not? I mean, we as like the general public don't know enough about windows or the facade to even ask those kind of questions, to even
right.
be able to say. You can just say, whoa, what a view. But then, once you move in, you recognize you can't actually sit within 6 feet of the facade.
Well, it was an 82-degree sunny day yesterday, and I was installing an air conditioning unit for somebody on a fifth floor walk up in Chinatown. And so I look over, and the roommate has the shade open and the window open, glaring sun and baking, and she's not even home. And in the other bedroom, shades are shut, the air conditioning is blasting, and just like as inefficient of a layout as it comes. And I'm thinking in my head, like, all right, lower the shades. You can mitigate some of that solar gain, whatever it is, even if they want some airflow. I don't even think some of these things occur to register, or people think to ask these questions. And I bring that question up because you could say, yes, people prefer to control their indoor environment. But I love this debate and discussion about the window to wall ratio. And if people are comfortable living in a all glass unitized curtain wall building, having that floor to ceiling glass versus wanting some privacy. I don't know what you guys, I think that one is very person specific, or dependent on their preferences. But what has your reaction been to seeing people walk into that type of construction, and just the use of all glass buildings in multi? It makes sense in commercial office, but in a multifamily application.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's definitely a kind of user group that wants the view, wants that kind of very modern, let's call it, modern is a maybe antiquated term at this point with that kind of, building type, but wants that kind of experience, right? And I think though, regardless, whether you're the person who wants the punched opening, right, in a more classical building, with precasts around, and limited views out, you still want to be able to get on your phone and dial in the thermostat where you're sitting on the couch. It's like they're sort of decoupled in my mind. Like it's more like one is like the all glass is more about like the view and the user experience of, connection to their environment, right, visually. And maybe there's a prestige element to it as well. I don't know, a luxury element. But I think that what's interesting is there's no accommodation for difference in comfort criteria. Like regardless of what kind of building you're in, people they want to be comfortable. They're like, I don't, and they don't make the connection, right? But that's like the underlying thing that's always there, which is interesting.
Well, even, I mean, we both worked on the Domino building, and I was showing an architect what it looked like the other day because they wanted these very deep precast profiles, and they were worried about that interrupting the view from the inside. But I was like, no, the architect intentionally wanted that as a shading element. So
Yeah,
people not realizing that more informed designers are making these decisions because, yeah, sure, they have some aesthetic implications, but there's all these secondary benefits or impacts that some people don't know to ask or haven't explored.
You got to kind of rely on the architect to make the right design choices so that you can be comfortable, because the person on the street isn't going to know whether they're going to be comfortable in their new apartment or not just by their own experiences. I mean, even if you have something that has an Energy Star sticker in the window, you'd hope that would give you a fighting chance of being comfortable next to it, but it depends on what else is going on there too.
Yeah, Spencer and I talk about a lot of this, some of the nuance and the shortcomings in some of these CMAS regulations and codes. And you talk to my sister and her husband, and they see Energy Star rated window, and they're like, "We have really good performing windows, in our house," not even knowing what it is. Or so when you're marketing to the mass public, it really is all just a marketing and branding kind of game and name. And oh, we live in a LEED Gold or LEED certified building, or they
right.
did this, or it's a well that. And there is maybe a paradigm shift coming around, as Helen and I have spoken about, everybody sort of tightly in this industry, that the paradigm shift of really looking at as built building performance holistically. And that's sort of coming to the forefront today, not any of these, crafted lead related initiatives that the industry tried to implement. And I don't really know how I think it was the best they had at the time, but there were major shortcomings.
There's actually I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's an interesting program that that came out of Australia that's being adopted in the UK right now called Neighbours, NABERS, which is it's kind of like LEED, except that it requires as built performance measurement. It's really kind of cool, and it is driving, from my understanding, a real focus on the building envelope, because building owners want to have their stars that are awarded under this Neighbours scheme, and it's really changing the market. So I don't know what it's going to take to get something like that moved over to the US, but obviously we have building performance standards like in New York City, but that's kind of moving the worst buildings to not quite so bad. This Neighbours program seems to be moving, code buildings to even higher performance in new construction. So that's a really pretty nice trend, at least on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any critique I have of what's going on in this country is that we're taking so long to kind of step up. I mean, and I know it's gradual, right? You can't flip the building code on its head overnight and expect, everyone to just go along with it. I get it, but I think there's a lot to be said for some of the, the qualities that the LEED program has, but they're totally different from the conversation that we're having, right? Like what we're ultimately talking about is, the operational energy, to have a building, function and provide, appropriate indoor comfort for its occupants, right? And LEED totally missed the mark initially on like making that kind of the front and center topic, but it had different parameters. It was, It's like, oh, like you can have bicycle racks and get points. It's like, well, but bicycle racks are important in some communities, right? And for some lifestyles, like it's better to have them than not in some areas, right? So, I think what we're ultimately, I think, walking around is this idea that there doesn't seem to be like a pressure or a real focus with the new code developments towards, really aggressively going after like lowering the operational energy of buildings, right? And it's starting, U values are helpful, right? Like you start with the building envelope, right? It's essentially the passive house like philosophy of design, right? Where you model the whole thing and you try and lower kind of the target operational energy of the building based on its occupancy and climate orientation, right? Function, but you have to validate that after the fact, of course, right? And I think that's so important. And I think it's going to be more important going forward as we start to look at like, embodied carbon and operational carbon being like real parameters that people are actually interested in measuring and controlling with their projects.
Yeah, the other elephant in the country or room obviously is the sort of the existing building market. And
Yeah.
we look at these anomaly case studies where they went so above and beyond. But like I said, when I was in Chinatown, you just see these rows and rows and rows of 5 to 10 story buildings that just have these garbage windows in them. And it's just, original windows from the 80s. And there's either not enough incentive or motive, or it's too much of an undertaking to replace all the windows. And thinking about either what's readily available or incentives or other sort of remediation remedies in place. I mean, Elliot last week was talking about that Con Ed program where all of a sudden there's all kinds of energy give back and credits for replacing the windows in kind. And just like the flaw in the approach and model, but at least there's initiative and motive to try to upgrade the buildings. So if it wasn't such a vast, intimidating undertaking for owners to invest in the existing building, then it could sort of flip the mindset.
I mean, I think that's the challenge, right? It's the cost and the risk of upgrading the windows and the envelope. I mean, I talked to quite a few people trying to understand the issues with the retrofit, and I didn't quite understand the difficulty in understanding the as-built situation and what the anchor system was like, what the load could take, and then having this huge risk, and that you only understand the scope of what you got yourself into once you've started the project.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a discovery phase, initially. Like you sort of have an intention of what you're going to do, but you don't really even know what structurally is going on. You might open the wall and determine that you have to replace far more than you thought, just due
Yeah.
to corrosion or, undersized elements being in place.
Mhm.
It's really it can be an unpredictable cost for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of the
Yeah.
contractors were telling me they might not even have the competence in their teams to be able to address what they're going to see. So
Well,
there's
across the
a
board, from owners to contractors to facade consultants and architects, I think there's specialists that focus on this area. But owners and contractors aside, I think there's maybe architects that might find it intimidating or might not want to take on that type of project because they don't. At the end of the day, there's a liability on their end as well.
Yeah, in California, a glazing contractor was telling me that basically if you touch it, you got to upgrade it to the seismic, the new seismic code. And that's a pretty big deterrent to not want to touch a building.
Yeah, if you look at it the wrong way, you got to upgrade it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess what are you guys focusing on right now? Let's start. I talked to you a lot, Spencer, but Helen, in the past couple months, what's sort of been on your mind, or some of the conversations that you're having newer than, some of the things we've been discussing, I think have been prevalent the past couple of years. So what's really been the theme of your year thus far?
So one of the things that's come out of, I think I mentioned the work that I was doing with FTI to understand the barriers to adoption of high performance technology. What came out of that, other than a really good understanding of that, was the issues that I think that we had discussed, and I just wrote a blog about it, is the fact that we always think that we're in this battle for the wall with the opaque elements, but it actually appears that we're in the battle for the wall with imports, overseas imports. So when you see codes moving, like they are in Massachusetts, like they are in New York, really moving to the high performance products that, you know, Skyline and Schuko produce. And that's, you know, where we want to move our industry. We're finding that it's cheaper for general contractors to go award contracts overseas or bring in lower cost windows from.
So
from
if you read Spencer's smirk, I think he well his eyebrows smirked. So
right,
he has some thoughts on this topic, especially given he has a lot of experience with it. So Spencer, what's your experience been? I don't know, call it the past decade, particularly operating in a market like New York that's become call it more overseas than not.
I mean, look, the reality is if you want, you know, a triple pane IGU, right, with even deeper than, you know, half-inch spacer bars, right? It's more cost effective to bring that over from Europe than it is to buy it domestically right now. You know, and that's due to the fact that, you know, that kind of glass assembly has been pervasive in that market for so much longer than in the US. It's not specialty.
It's
You know,
business as usual, right?
It's the equivalent to the 1-inch IGU that you buy in North America, in the United States. So
you think it's a means and methods thing, not simply a labor rate thing?
Well, I think the labor rate,
right?
yeah, I think the labor rate piece comes into it on a specific, you know, source location discussion. And it is also, you know, relevant, but I think above that, you know, it's the same thing with insulated window frames, right? And passive house level performance in your window frames. There are so many more options in Europe, right? Because it's so much more pervasive. And naturally, in any market, when you have a lot of competition, you have a lot of volume, your costs are going to come down, right? And so that's fundamentally, you know, the starting point. And when we're talking about sourcing from Europe, I mean, you know, Asia is a totally different animal. But, you know, I think it's allowing those companies, you know, to come into the United States market more effectively because they're like, well, we've been doing this for years. We know exactly, you know, how to do this, how to do it well, and we've, you know, optimized our costs for producing this kind of product. And then you move to the secondary conversation, which is what's your labor rate? What's your local kind of labor market and material market condition? And how does that affect your end price? You know, transportation, logistics, tariffs, all of that's involved too, sure. But, you know, in general, United States and Europe, there's kind of a low barrier to entry at the moment, right? So it's not too bad. But I think that, you know, if the United States glazing market pivoted to being focused on triple pane IGU production and assemblies, I think you could reach cost parity, but we're just not there. I mean, it's also our climate, right? Like you look at all the different climate zones in the United States, like not everywhere needs a triple pane IGU, right? You know, there's arguments to avoid that in some markets. So, you know, I think what we're really talking about are the colder climates, the more northern reaches of the country. I mean, sure, there's arguments for like, you know, the cooling dominated climates as well, benefiting from better insulation of facades, you know, but that's like so far from the mindset of like our industry. It's kind of
So
funny.
what
But
about if you go to forget triple for a second? I mean,
yeah,
so these are the top. It's triple, which is really only applicable in Seattle and Boston because you don't see it widespread anywhere else. Maybe Toronto, but talking domestically. And then the hyper-insulated frames for passive house, which it's more commonplace. But what about laminated glass, which you'll have required in hurricane zones, so predominantly Florida, and then so much of it here in New York because of our acoustic requirements per code. So I don't think any owner would elect for it, but we can't get around it. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with owners about hotels where they had an acoustic consultant. We got the report back. They say it's going to be this. We would recommend a 48 STC. And then we price it and they're like, go with the standard insulated. So, because it's not required. And it's very, very hard to justify it until they're trying to sleep in that hotel or multifamily unit and experience it. So,
yeah.
What about laminated glass as well? I'd expect you'd be paying a hefty premium to produce it here.
I think, Helen, that's probably more in your wheelhouse to answer, right?
I don't have a huge amount of knowledge on the import specific to laminated glass. I would say though that from a hurricane perspective, I guess if you were importing a whole system, you'd obviously have to have it hurricane tested. I guess you could import the insulating laminated or the laminated to go into the configuration without testing.
Well,
But I don't
Yeah,
know.
I
I
just
don't
think
know
I,
whether
I would
people are
I
doing
would
that.
love to somehow see, I don't know, just the insulated market alone in New York City and what percentage of it is produced domestically versus overseas. But
Well,
I'd have a real
I actually just pulled the data. I don't know what the bait, so in terms of fraction, I don't know, but I know what you can get it from the US import census data. So I can send you a link to the data. But there was quite a lot coming in from Europe. So you can track how much is coming in from Europe, from Asia, from specific European countries into New York, where the destination New York. You can also look at the destination Massachusetts, any of the states in North America. And if I remember correctly, I have to get it the right way around, the imports of vinyl windows, just vinyl windows, I'm trying to remember the data for IG, but it's not on the tip of my tongue, but vinyl windows, for example, I think quintupled and quadrupled into New York and Massachusetts from Europe since 2019.
well, I mean, I don't know, Spencer, do you think the conversation or numbers become skewed or vary if we're talking about whole assembly imports versus just glass?
yeah, I think they're different categories entirely for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a bit of a perception, from the glazing contractor side, right? That glass is somewhat of a commodity, right, in our industry, where it's like if you can get the equivalent makeup from a different vendor at a lower price, same quality, you do it, right? And I know that that kind of glosses over a whole set of nuances and specific, products and their various benefits and differences. But the reality is that, you know, we can integrate various glazing infills into, different frame and curtain wall systems quite easily, right? That's how all the systems are designed for the most part. So, when you're in that situation, and glass can become such a cost driver on a project if it's got a laminated assembly, you of course, look at overseas options for better pricing, right? And this is where, I think the labor piece becomes front and center, and also the production methods. If you look at just, for example, the comparison of buying domestically versus going to China, for laminated glass, of course, there's going to be a massive price difference, right? And that's something that's so hard to kind of define in any other way than to say that, like, you're never going to be able to compete, right, domestically without some sort of heavy tariff structure, on those imports, because it's a completely different culture and labor market, and the material market is different there too. So, you know, if you're dealing with that comparison, right, and you're in a market where now every dollar counts on every job because everyone's being squeezed, from financing all the way down to procurement, then yeah, it kind of makes sense to me that you would see that increase in imports. And I'm not sure if, the data supports that argument, if we're seeing more glass coming from Europe than not, the same way we're seeing vinyl.
Yeah, I'm just looking, I just pulled the data actually. So in 2023, there was about $32 million worth of IG going into New York from around the world, of which the majority was coming from Europe. I don't know what the baseline is, though. Of course, I don't know how much is being sold in the total amount going into New York in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, you talk about glass being a commodity item. I think if your quality control process and supply chain is really, is it a commodity item? I think I think you would see some very high-end buildings and find out where some of the assemblies were produced and be surprised.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on the requirements too, right? I guess if we're
Sure.
looking at the use case of, like, simple clear over clear laminated assembly for the South Florida market, right? That's very different than, like, bird safe, specialty
For
frit,
sure. And I
low
think
iron
there's
with special coatings for something in, like, a residential project in New York, right?
and maybe you have some capabilities overseas in terms of like recycled content, recycled material content, or so forth, that might not be readily available here. Florida is really the only place that I've seen multiple hard specifications that say buy American only.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Europe they are willing. They've always been able to or until maybe recently, doing bigger sizes, oversized. They're willing to do more, I guess, custom type configurations.
And is
They
that
do a
because
lot.
their market demands it, or is it because they see that as a differentiating or competitive edge?
I think it's just typical what they do on the market. I mean, they do, the I think I saw on your feed, you were looking at stepped edges, right? I mean, stepped edges are standard in Europe.
Yeah.
Well,
I
yeah,
don't think
your name came up initially, Helen, when I was talking to Spencer about the toggle system.
that's right. Yep, that's right. I mean, their toggles, I mean, as you know, Schuko has a system.
But what's interesting with that particular detail, right? And I think it kind of leads into the capability to work with the kind of edge seal condition in a more specialty way, is that, you have a building code requirement in Germany specifically where you can't use structural silicone as the sole means of retaining glass in a
That's
facade,
right.
right?
So they have
So
to do something else.
it has to be mechanical retention, right? But then if you want the SG look, how do you do that, right? So that's where the toggle kind of came into existence as a design
But
solution.
was that implemented because of every other, local law that's been implemented in New York City, where you have some type of crisis or incident that gets everybody's attention, and they say, okay, your fire escapes have to be inspected every 5 years. Your brick has to be, the local law 11. Your facade has to be inspected by a licensed design professional. What happened in Germany that forced them to go in that direction? Was it a high rate of incidents of failures, or?
And that's kind of beyond my wheelhouse. I don't know the genesis of it. I do know that I don't know if it was one catastrophic incident, but I do know that like the continued practice is really kind of a belt and suspenders type of mentality, right? That's driving its kind of, being maintained as a requirement in the market, where you can have Dow providing whatever warranty they want, or GE, like they don't care. They're like, nope, mechanical retention must be in place, just in case someone messes up. So,
But what I don't understand is it's still like the clips, at least in some situations, you have to basically stick these channels into the silicone in the secondary seal. So they're still relying on silicone.
well, that's yeah, for the inner light primarily, but then
Yeah.
you still have, in addition to that, there's exterior mounted elements that are very cleverly concealed kind of in the joinery that retain the outer pane of glass in a more minimal fashion. But you're right, like the toggle alone does not restrain the exterior pane. So then you're relying on, the silicone within the IGU, so, but there's additional measures taken in it beyond that as well.
Has anyone made a push to bring the toggle here?
I mean, I've been
Well,
selling this.
yeah, that was a
Yeah, I
layup.
mean, I've
So
been
go
working
for
on it
it.
for 10 years, and what's funny is Shuko's not the only, one offering that kind of solution. You can get it from other vendors. I mean, it pops up on specialty projects. Conair has their own solution, right? There's a few different ways to do it, but I think ultimately what it ends up boiling down to is that it's a deviation from the standard edge detail in IGU production, right? And so if you have automated IGU production, which most of the companies in the U.S. that are operating at scale as glass fabricators have that, it becomes a huge cost premium because now all of a sudden you're deviating from their standard production process.
Well,
There's
I
You got
also
to
QC
think
stick
issues.
you got to stick little channels in at an appropriate
Yeah,
distance around the perimeter, making
right.
I
sure
think
that
this
you've got the
market is
right amount of silicone.
Right, exactly. And so it becomes like specialty work, right? And there's where we come to that like intersection of like cost-driven specialty work versus, something that you can get from Europe much more cost effectively because it's more pervasive in the market. It's more common. So it's not
Well, do you think
specialty.
this market is driven, especially designers and specifiers and owners directing them to design something that multiple people can competitively bid on versus maybe do you have a different mentality overseas?
Well, what's interesting is fundamentally, if you look at the way we talk about the performance of glazing in this country, it's from that perspective. It's from a comparative analysis of, I have one vendor over here and one vendor over here. I want to compare these two windows. Give me the U value of the window at the exact same size for both vendors, right? It doesn't matter what project it's on. Give me the NFRC size, right? And in Europe, the calculation method, the approach is different. It's project specific. You do project specific sizing for all of your U value assessments because it's more about the philosophy that you're looking at the actual heat flow through the actual project specific assembly. So I think, if we just look at the kind of landscape of how we talk about, glazing performance as a baseline, it's inherent in this country that it's more about comparative analysis between vendors, and it's less about the project conditions in that way. I mean, there's always projects where you do project specific analysis and energy models that can get very detailed and project specific, U value calculations, but NFRC is kind of the gold standard, right, for initial specs and discussions, right? And it's based on gateway sizes. So
I partially think it's also limited resources to do a real as-built or true analysis of these buildings. The highest end buildings where they are running that energy model day one and throughout the design assist process, changing all the various inputs to get an accurate model. But for every one of those, there's 10 other buildings that are not going through that exercise.
yeah, I mean I don't know the data on that. I do know that there's certainly like tools and methods for, let's call it like smaller scale projects. Single family is a whole separate category with its own like, industry participants, like HERS rating and Energy Star and whatnot that have like criteria around this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's very common in commercial, multifamily projects that I look at where, there's just the NFRCU value and that's it. That's all they want for their energy model. And they might be doing area weighted averages based on that, maybe, but there's a lot less nuance than I think you would want to see. And that kind of ties all the way back to the start of our discussion, which is the mechanical system design, which I'm not a mechanical engineer, but I know that like mechanical system engineering in this country is like, it's very conservative, right? It's like, oh, you need this many BTUs. Let's just give you a few more. Like, let's just kind of gloss over this. And we have our standards that we follow for doing these calculations. But the building envelope, I think, could play a much, much bigger role, in defining that on a more detailed level. There's more risk to dial it in that way, but
Also, are the mechanical consultants incentivized to work with the facade consultants?
They don't tend to. I mean, there was a couple of bits of feedback that we got when we were doing this research. Is that as you said, we had a glazing contractor who said, you know what, compared to Europe, the HVAC consultants and or contractors are so much more conservative. And then there's another consultant who made the comment that the HVAC engineers just don't know enough about the envelope. And what they do is they come in at the end and they put in a massive HVAC system. And he had this analogy, which I love, and I'm probably going to misquote him really badly. This is Ted Keswick from University of Toronto. He says, it's like this major league pitcher who's got this amazing throwing arm and everything else is flab, because they've got this great HVAC system.
Yeah.
And really appalling, just not very good envelope.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you go to like Arizona, right? You look at some of the like residential HVAC units on single family houses. I mean, they're like massive. You show this to somebody from Europe, they're like, this is for like an office building. Like, why do you have such a large? It's because the envelope is terrible, right? There's like no shading, huge windows, right? There's curtains on the inside. So like that's not really doing much for you, And yeah, the solution is just wash it, just throw cold air at it, just pump it, So
and then when the electricity goes out,
yeah, right.
We've got a really big problem.
Yeah, it's a crisis, it's so like that's to me like the thing that I'm hoping really becomes front and center in the dialogue. And I know, Facade Tectonics Institute is, had this as kind of a cornerstone, is this idea of resiliency, and I'm as much as I am so, like sad about the state of climate change and these extreme weather events that we have. What it does highlight is the lack of resiliency in a lot of our building infrastructure, and
Right.
if there's one thing I've learned, it's like people will not be incentivized to change their behavior or buying decision making process until they're uncomfortable, right? And so the more examples of that we have, hopefully kind of spurs the movement more aggressively to instigate change.
And actually, one thing that Ted Kuzik said is he says really the solution to having better or incentivizing better envelopes is actually, he says it's pretty simple. You just mandate a thermal resilience requirement in code.
Yeah.
Because that would fix it, right? And
Yeah.
then you mandate appropriate commissioning and testing post-construction.
Yeah.
And he said, though, and then you just train and educate everyone as much as possible. And he said,
Yeah.
that's his recipe.
I think it makes a lot of sense, you know, and I think honestly in the single family market, you could probably in the future tie it even into insurance rates, you know, like if you know that you're going to have a high risk climate that you're building in, like why not? You know, it's versus like being in Texas and like you don't have heat and all your pipes are bursting and the home gets destroyed. It's like I don't know. I don't see why we wouldn't try and change the structure of that, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a really important place for insurance, even in the commercial space too, to see if there's any insurance incentives that can be achieved through this.
Well, this was fun. I think we should have more from the Facade Tectonics Institute on kind of sharing experiences and initiatives and interests. I am gonna take a shot at them and tell them to get their own podcast name. But other than that, no, I'd love to have other members of the Institute on and push sort of what's the findings and the mission of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's come join too. Adrian, your voice would be it'd be great.
Yeah. So thank you both for coming on. This was fun again.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks again.
Of course. Bye, guys.
Yeah.